A man steps up in front of a crowded room, mocking Keanu Reeves without hesitation. His words are sharp, cruel, and filled with arrogance. He's the type of person who thrives on humiliation, thinking he's untouchable. But what happens next shocks everyone, especially him. Keanu stands there, silent, observing, his calm demeanor like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The man doesn't know it yet, but the moment he crosses the line, everything is about to change. The crowd's energy shifts, the tension builds, and justice is coming. And Keanu? He's the one who's going to deliver it. What would you do if you saw someone being humiliated in front of a crowd? Would you step in, or would you stay silent? Think about the power of standing up for what's right, even in the smallest of ways. As you watch this unfold, ask yourself, how far would you go to defend justice? Hit the like button if you believe that everyone deserves respect, and share this story with your friends. Let's talk about it in the comments. How would you react if you were in Keanu's shoes? The crowd waits in silence, unsure of what will happen next. The man keeps taunting Keanu, not even realizing the gravity of his words. He's pushing, testing limits, thinking he's the one in control. But Keanu's still, like a force of nature, held in check. In a split second, everything changes. The tension snaps, and the man's arrogance becomes his downfall. Keanu's simple, words hit hard, cutting through the noise like a blade. The room goes quiet. The crowd is stunned, and the man is about to learn the price of disrespect. The room buzzes with laughter and conversation, the kind of chatter you'd expect at a party, where people feel safe in their own little world. But tonight there's an unexpected guest, Keanu Reeves. The iconic actor, known for his humility and kindness, stands off to the side, trying to blend in like he always does. But there's one man in the room who doesn't care about the unspoken rule of respect. He's noticed Keanu, and his presence triggers something in him, something sharp, something cruel. Without missing a beat, the man steps forward, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. He starts mocking Keanu, his words dripping with venom. The insults come fast and unrelenting. He pokes fun at Keanu's movies, his demeanor, even his life outside of the spotlight. The crowd shifts uncomfortably, but no one dares to step in. They think Keanu will just brush it off the way he always does, but this time something feels different. Keanu remains calm, his eyes locked on the man, but there's a weight to his silence. The crowd watches, unsure of what will happen next. The man continues, fueled by the reaction he's getting. He's clearly enjoying the attention, oblivious to the fact that he's playing a dangerous game. What he doesn't realize yet is that Keanu's quiet demeanor isn't weakness, it's restraint. And when the moment comes, it will be a moment of justice that no one saw coming. Keanu Reeves wasn't the type to draw attention to himself. In fact, he preferred the exact opposite. At this event, a casual gathering of industry professionals and some longtime fans, he was there to simply enjoy the evening. Keanu had never been one for the spotlight outside of his acting roles. His humility was part of what made him so beloved. But tonight, as he leaned against the wall, something felt off. He wasn't the kind of man to let his presence dominate a room. But for some reason tonight, the tension felt thicker than usual. Javier, the protagonist of this story, was also in the room, standing by the bar, nursing a drink, trying to blend in. He had heard the rumors about how Keanu was down to earth, how he treated everyone with respect, no matter who they were. But it wasn't until Javier had met Keanu in person that he truly understood the level of humility the actor exuded. He wasn't just a celebrity who shrugged off compliments. He was someone who seemed to genuinely care about others, always offering kindness without any agenda. But tonight, something wasn't right. It started as a murmur, the shift of energy. In the room, Javier, glancing around, saw a man, one of the guests, approaching Keanu. At first, it seemed innocent enough. A handshake, maybe a word of recognition, nothing out of the ordinary. But then the words began to fly. The man was a mid-level producer, known for his sharp tongue and even sharper opinions. People tolerated him, but not out of admiration, more out of a fear of his biting criticism. He had a reputation for putting others down in front of crowds, using his wit and status to belittle those who couldn't fight back. Tonight, he had set his sights on Keanu. "You're really just an actor, huh? Some people might think that's a little too much for someone who can't even walk down the street without being recognized. I mean, do you ever wonder what you really offer? You've been playing the same character for years. I guess that's all you've got, huh?" Javier winced as the man's words cut through the air, his voice dripping with mockery. He watched Keanu's face for any sign of a reaction, but there was none. Keanu just stood there, calm, almost stoic, his eyes not even narrowing in defense. He didn't rise to the bait. The man, emboldened by the lack of a response, continued. His voice grew louder, more confident, as he tried to get the crowd to laugh. "You know, for someone who's supposed to be so smart, I bet you still think the world's a nice place. How does it feel to know you'll always be the nice guy, the guy no one actually respects?" The crowd around them started to shift uncomfortably, glances exchanged. Some people awkwardly turned away, unsure of whether to intervene. But most were passive, waiting for Keanu to react, for him to laugh it off, or to snap back at the man. After all, wasn't this just how Keanu was? Always calm, always collected? But Keanu wasn't laughing. He wasn't even speaking. He simply stood still, taking in the words, letting the tension hang in the air. There was a quiet power in his stillness. His gaze didn't waver from the man's face, his body language subtly alert, as though he knew exactly where this was. Javier felt something shift in the room, a collective recognition that Keanu wasn't going to engage in the usual banter. This wasn't going to be one of those moments where the audience could expect the actor to deflect the insults with humor or grace. There was an unspoken understanding building among the onlookers. This was no ordinary situation. The more the man spoke, the more Javier noticed how everyone seemed to step back, as if to avoid getting caught in the crossfire. Keanu's quiet. Observation had a magnetic pull. It was as if the world was holding its breath. The crowd seemed to realize that Keanu wasn't going to seek validation or even try to fight back with words. But deep down, Javier knew there was something bigger about to unfold. Keanu wasn't avoiding the confrontation. He was simply waiting for the right moment to act. The room was heavy with anticipation, the weight of the man's insults hanging thick in the air. Javier couldn't help but wonder how far this man would go before crossing the line. He wanted to speak up, to intervene, but he hesitated. The room was waiting for Keanu, and in a way, so was he. The tension continued to rise, with each passing second making the room feel smaller. Keanu Reeves, who had always exuded calm, now stood like a stone in the middle of the storm. His silence felt almost deliberate, like he was waiting for something, the right moment, the right words, perhaps a shift in the energy of the room, before he stepped in. The man's insults became sharper, more personal. He was no longer just mocking Keanu's movies, he was attacking the very essence of who the actor was. I mean, honestly, how many more decades are you going to play the nice guy routine? You're not fooling anyone, Keanu. It's all just an act. You're just another celebrity who wants to be adored without really putting in the work. The crowd's discomfort deepened. Javier, who had been watching the whole interaction unfold, felt a sense of helplessness creeping in. It wasn't that he didn't want to stand up to the bully, it was that he felt powerless in this situation. The man's presence dominated the room, his cutting words cutting through the air like a sharp blade. But no one seemed willing to intervene, not even Keanu's fans who were present. They all felt the weight of the situation but couldn't find a way to disrupt the cycle of cruelty. Keanu's stillness only made the man bolder. The more Keanu didn't respond, the more the man felt he had the upper hand. He wasn't just insulting Keanu anymore. He was trying to make a spectacle of the moment. A few people nervously chuckled, unsure if they were supposed to join in or if it was better to stay quiet. The atmosphere was electric, filled with unspoken tension. People were waiting for a reaction, any reaction from Keanu. The man leaned in closer, his words now dripping with disdain. "You know, people talk. They say you're nothing more than a glorified action star who got lucky. I bet you're tired of hearing it, but you'll never escape the fact that you're just a face in the crowd. And one day people will forget all about you. You'll be just another faded memory, Keanu." Javier watched the crowd around them, noticing how some people began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. He saw a few people glance at Keanu, but they didn't meet his gaze. It was like they were scared of what might happen next. Everyone could feel it. The moment of reckoning was coming. They knew that something had to give. Keanu's face was impassive. His gaze never wavered. The man, however, was relentless, feeding off the silence and trying to push Keanu further. He took a step closer, his words louder, almost taunting. "What, no comeback, Keanu? You're supposed to be some kind of philosopher, right? But I don't see any deep thoughts coming out of you. Just the same old routine. You can't even stand up for yourself. What happened to that tough guy from The Matrix? All I see now is a tired, washed-up actor who can't take a joke." As if on cue, the energy in the room shifted again. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, people looking around as if waiting for someone to do something. But no one moved. Keanu was still silent, and the tension was becoming unbearable. Javier, who had been standing in the corner, felt his heart race. This wasn't just an attack on Keanu anymore. It was a public display of cruelty, and it was reaching a breaking point. It wasn't just about the words being spoken. It was about how the man was weaponizing the crowd's silence, feeding off their collective discomfort. And that's when the shift came. It wasn't dramatic at first, but the room seemed to take a collective breath. Keanu's stillness had done something. It had become a quiet, unspoken rebellion against the antagonist's behavior. It was clear to everyone now that Keanu wasn't going to respond with anger. He wasn't going to lash out with words or insults, but something else was building. The anticipation of justice. People started to realize that this wasn't a situation where the antagonist could continue without facing consequences. The man, unable to resist the power he thought he wielded, took another step forward, almost daring Keanu to react. His smug expression twisted into something more arrogant, his eyes glinting with the belief that he had won. But then, in a split second, Keanu moved. It wasn't a loud or grand gesture, but it was enough to change the course of the evening. Keanu's eyes locked onto the man's, and for the first time, there was something in his gaze. Something sharp, something that cut through the noise of the room. He opened his mouth, his voice calm but carrying weight. "No one should be treated like that. Not here. Not ever." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. It wasn't a confrontation filled with fury. There were no raised voices, no dramatic speeches. Just Keanu, his quiet intervention breaking the tension and shifting the power dynamics in an instant. The man froze, his expression faltering for the first time. The room, which had been buzzing with tension, was now eerily silent. It wasn't the anger that had people on edge, it was the complete shift in the narrative. The crowd had been passive, uncomfortable, unsure of what to do. But now, in this single moment, they were all aware of what had just happened. Keanu's intervention wasn't about being loud or making a spectacle of himself. It was about standing up for what was right, quietly and firmly, without fanfare. The man who had been humiliating Keanu was now the one who was exposed, his arrogance turning to vulnerability in the blink of an eye. It was a moment of justice, not delivered with force, but with quiet authority. Javier watched in awe as the room absorbed the moment. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. The man, for all his bravado, now stood alone, his words having lost all their sting in the face of Keanu's quiet strength. It was a victory without violence, a moment of clarity in a world that too often rewarded cruelty. The silence that followed was louder than any words could have been. The man stood there frozen, his mouth still open in mid-insult, his eyes widening as he processed what had just happened. Keanu's words, quiet, measured, but forceful, had cut through the noise like a blade, and in that split second the whole room felt the shift. The man's bravado wavered, and in the pit of his stomach he must have felt it too. The realization that he had pushed too far. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way Keanu had spoken them. There was no anger, no shouting, just a calm certainty that reverberated through the room. In those few seconds, Keanu had stripped away the layers of bravado the man had been hiding behind. The atmosphere was thick with an overwhelming sense of justice, but it wasn't loud, it wasn't showy. It simply was. The crowd shifted. You could feel the collective tension begin to release, but only in the most subtle of ways. Some people looked at each other, eyebrows raised. Some just stared at Keanu, unsure of what had just transpired. But what everyone in the room understood, whether they realized it in that instant or not, was that Keanu had delivered a quiet blow to the man's pride, one that was far more powerful than any public humiliation could have been. The man, who had been so sure of himself moments before, faltered. His posture slumped and his confidence started to crack. The insults he had been hurling at Keanu seemed to fall flat, evaporating in the air like smoke. The crowd, which had been on edge, now had their eyes locked onto the scene in a mix of disbelief and awe. For a moment, the man's arrogance seemed to hold, as though he might try to salvage the situation. His face twisted in frustration as he opened his mouth to retort, perhaps trying to regain his dominance. But the words caught in his throat. The confidence he'd worn so proudly was unraveling. Keanu, still calm, stood there watching him, a silent presence. No one moved. The man took a step back, his face flushed with frustration. The energy in the room shifted again. This time it wasn't just a quiet justice that hung in the air, but a palpable sense of vulnerability from the man. His posture, once filled with arrogant certainty, was now deflated. The crowd noticed it too, how his words no longer carried the weight they once had. The man had become, in that moment, a caricature of himself. The jokes he had cracked about. Keanu seemed meaningless now, drained of all their power. The room was still. No one spoke. No one dared to move. Then, someone's phone rang. A sharp, unwelcome sound in the stillness, but it was enough to break the tension. In an instant, the moment was captured. A bystander had been recording, their phone held high. The video, showing the exact moment when Keanu had spoken up, when the atmosphere had changed, was now out there. It wasn't loud or theatrical. There were no dramatic close-ups or slow-motion shots. It was simply a moment captured in time. The video would soon go viral. What had started as a quiet, unnoticed interaction had now become something that couldn't be ignored. The man, who had thought he could humiliate Keanu without consequence, now found himself the subject of scorn. His previous words, once sharp and biting, had transformed into a reflection of his own insecurity. And the crowd, once passive, now understood exactly what had happened. They saw the cowardice beneath the man's cruelty. They saw how Keanu had stood firm in his silence, not letting the man get away with disrespect. Keanu didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't need accolades or applause. His actions spoke louder than any of the insults hurled at him. He stood, silent but resolute, not for a victory, but because he knew what was right. And now, the moment was out of his hands. The viral video was the final nail in the coffin for the antagonist's pride. The man looked around the room, his face pale, as he realized that no one was on his side. No one was laughing anymore. The people who had once been too nervous to speak up now stood firm, their collective judgment speaking louder than any single person could. The antagonist's arrogance had turned to ashes in the wake of Keanu's calm intervention. The celebrity's quiet role in all of this was never about grand gestures. It wasn't about making a spectacle or drawing attention to his actions. It was about the power of quiet authority. The way Keanu had stood there, unyielding, without needing to shout or demand respect, made the man's earlier insult seem even more petty and small. It wasn't Keanu's response that had left the room in awe. It was the way his very presence and his simple words had shifted the atmosphere, making the antagonist's cruelty seem utterly ridiculous. The man's pride had crumbled in front of an audience, and no amount of bluster could rebuild it now. As he stumbled for words, trying to salvage what little was left of his dignity, Keanu simply turned away. He didn't need to say another word. His job was done. The crowd would take care of the rest. With a soft, barely perceptible shake of his head, Keanu walked away. His quiet departure was almost like an afterthought, unnoticed by the man who still stood there, floundering. Keanu's exit, however, left a lasting impact. The room, which had once been filled with tension, now felt a sense of peace, a quiet resolution that wasn't brought on by anger, but by simple justice. And it was a justice that the man would never forget. But the real story wasn't in what happened next. It was in the ripple effect. The video that was shared across social media and news outlets, the way the man's actions were exposed to the world, how the tide of public opinion shifted in an instant. The humiliation wasn't just in the moment, it was in the consequences. That followed. The viral video showed more than just an actor standing up for himself. It showed that no one could get away with cruelty, not even in a room full of people who had once been too passive to speak up. Keanu had been the catalyst, but it was the crowd, the people who witnessed it, the ones who shared the video, that would carry the message forward. That was the true power of this moment. The ripple effect wasn't just about one person taking a stand, it was about how it inspired others to do the same. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift, but its impact was undeniable. The room, once filled with the tension of the man's taunts and Keanu's quiet observation, now felt lighter, almost as if a great weight had been lifted. The man, who had been so sure of his ability to manipulate and humiliate others, stood, like a shadow of himself. The insults had stopped, but their echoes lingered in the room. The crowd, once silent, was now filled with murmurs, some curious, some sympathetic, others simply in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. But the true shift wasn't just in the air around them. It was in the eyes of those who had witnessed the moment unfold, the way they regarded the man who had once held their attention with sharp words. His arrogance had crumbled, and the vulnerability that had taken its place was stark. He stood there, trying to regain his composure, but there was no going back. Keanu had done what no one else in that room had the courage to do. He had spoken up, not with anger, but with quiet authority. And the room responded. Javier, who had been a silent observer of the entire exchange, couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment ripple through him. He had been ready to step in, to say something, to do something, but Keanu had done it without fanfare. It was as if the mere act of standing firm in the face of ridicule had set everything right. The man's cruelty had been exposed for what it was, and in the silence that followed, there was a sense of finality. The crowd, who had been passive just moments before, now looked at the man differently. His arrogance, once seen as a display of power, was now a source of shame. The silence that hung in the air was deafening. People looked away from him, unsure of how to approach the man who had just been publicly humiliated by his own actions. They no longer saw him as someone who could control the room with his sharp tongue. They saw him as weak, as a man who had shown his true colors, and no amount of posturing would change that. Keanu's role in that moment may have been subtle, but the effect of his words would echo far beyond that night. The crowd that had watched it unfold would carry the memory of what happened, and the ripple effect continued. The message was clear. Standing up for justice, no matter how quietly, had the power to change the course of everything. Keanu's moment was one that reminded the world that sometimes, silence can be louder than any shout. Keanu's intervention wasn't about revenge, nor was it about taking a stand for personal glory. It was about doing what was right in a moment of injustice, about quietly stepping in when others might hesitate. In a world that often values loud voices and public confrontation, Keanu showed that sometimes the most powerful act is the one that doesn't demand attention at all. His quiet words didn't just expose the antagonist's cruelty, they revealed the power of empathy, the importance of standing up for others, even without seeking recognition. In that simple moment, Keanu reminded us that justice doesn't always require a spectacle. It doesn't always need to be dramatic or loud to be effective. Sometimes all it takes is a few words, a quiet intervention, and the courage to do what's right when no one else will. The ripple effect of his actions speaks to the lasting power of small acts of justice. It encourages us all to reflect on our own behavior. When we see others being treated unfairly, do we speak up? Do we stand by in silence? Or do we quietly, but firmly, ensure that justice is done? Now, it's your turn. If you saw someone being humiliated, or treated unfairly, would you speak up? Would you have the courage to intervene, even in the quietest way possible? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about how we can all be a force for good in the world, even in small, quiet moments. Let us know how you would have handled it. Your actions can make a difference, no matter how big or small.